Of course I thought it was romantic. That's the part I can't get past, even now. Not the money. I've made a kind of grim peace with the money. Or at least I've stopped doing the arithmetic at 3 in the morning, which is the closest thing to peace a 69-year-old man with 31,000 pounds left to his name is likely to find. What I can't shake is the memory of how I felt standing in that land office in Doi Saket, watching her sign her name on the Chanote title deed, thinking, this is the most romantic thing I have ever done. Putting her name on that document, handing her something permanent, something rooted. A man who spent 40 years growing things in the ground thought that signing over a piece of Thai earth to the woman he loved was an act of profound commitment. Turns out, she'd already agreed the sale price with her brother 2 months before I ever picked up the pen. Let me start somewhere sensible, which is Shropshire, and a nursery business I ran for the better part of 3 decades. Nothing grand. 2 acres outside Shrewsbury, polytunnels and outdoor beds, perennials mostly, and a reasonable trade in specimen shrubs, the kind of plants that take years to reach anything worth selling, and which reward patience in a way that the annual bedding market never quite does. My father had started it. I took it over in my 30s when he couldn't manage it anymore, and I built it into something that turned a modest profit and gave me the specific satisfaction of working with my hands in soil every day of my working life. I was never going to be wealthy from it. I knew that going in, and it never particularly bothered me. I sold it in 2019, the business and the land both, to a horticultural college that wanted the site for student projects, and walked away with £198,000 after the solicitor and the tax. My pension savings, accumulated through a personal pension I'd been feeding since my 40s, added another £57,000. Total, £255,000. My wife Elaine had died in 2016 of a stroke. She was 61. We'd been married for 34 years and had 2 grown children, a son in Bristol and a daughter in Edinburgh, both of whom I am close to in the particular way of parents who have lost a spouse together and been drawn toward each other by it. The 3 years between Elaine's death and the nursery sale were years I got through, rather than years I lived. I kept the business going because the business was a reason to get up, and the soil and the propagation benches and the early mornings in the polytunnels were the closest thing to company I had for a long stretch. When I sold it, I had no plan beyond the vague certainty that I needed to go somewhere I had never associated with anything that had already happened to me. A man at my church, a retired civil engineer named Neil, who had been living part of the year in Chiang Mai for several seasons, invited me to visit in January of 2020. He was patient about it. He'd mentioned it several times over 18 months, and I'd deferred. And then one Sunday I said yes. I'm not entirely sure what changed. I think I'd finally run out of reasons to stay where I was. Chiang Mai in January is what people mean when they call a place perfect. The cool season brings temperatures that a man from Shropshire finds not just tolerable but actively pleasant. The sky goes a particular shade of blue that seems higher and cleaner than anything I was used to. And the vegetation in the hills around the city, the forest roads up toward Doi Inthanon, the orchards and rice fields in the valleys east of the city toward Doi Saket, reminded me, in the best possible way, of the business I'd given up. Things grew here the way things grow in a good garden, extravagantly, without apology, in colors that made no particular concession to restraint. I liked that. I felt something ease in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. I met An in February, on my 4th week in the city. Neil had suggested I go to the district land office in Doi Saket to look into the process for foreigners purchasing property, not because I was seriously considering buying anything yet, but because understanding the legal landscape was sensible preparation for any longer-term thinking. She was 24 years old and worked as a clerk at the office, processing applications, filing documents, managing the queue of rural landowners and developers, and the occasional confused foreigner, who arrived with incomplete paperwork. She was the person who explained to me, with a business-like patience that I found immediately appealing, that I would not be able to own land outright as a foreign national, that the legal structures available to me were leasehold arrangements or holding through a Thai company or purchasing through a Thai spouse, and that any of these paths required careful legal preparation. She said all of this in functional English and handed me a printed information sheet that the office provided for foreign inquirers. Our interaction lasted perhaps 12 minutes. I went back the following week with a question about long-term lease registration that Neil's lawyer had raised. On answered it. I went back the week after with another question, which I'm now honest enough to admit I could have answered by phone. And we spoke for 20 minutes, and she told me that she had grown up in the Doi Saket area, east of the city, that her family had farmed rice for 2 generations, that she had taken the land office position because it offered stable government income, and because she found the legal dimensions of property genuinely interesting. She said this with what seemed to me like quiet intellectual pride, and I found it appealing in the specific way that competence is always appealing, the sense of someone who knew their subject and inhabited it comfortably. I want to describe what she looked like, and then I want to explain why I'm going to resist doing so at length, because I've noticed, in the conversations I've had about this over the past year, that whenever a man of my age describes a young Thai woman who did him harm, the description becomes its own trap. Either she was so beautiful that the audience forgives the stupidity, or she was ordinary looking and the audience can't understand the attraction. The truth is that she was a pleasant-looking 24-year-old woman who smiled easily and spoke to me as though I were a person worth talking to. At 68, this was the year before my 69th birthday, that's more than enough. Those months of early acquaintance with Aun, February through to June roughly, deserve more careful description than I usually give them, because the careful description is the part that explains what happened. I've noticed that when people hear the broad outlines of this story, they slot it into a category they already have. Old man, young woman, obvious exploitation, willful blindness. And some of that is accurate. But the texture of those months was not what that category implies. It wasn't performative. It wasn't a woman in sequins at a bar insisting she loved me and needed money for her sick mother within 40 minutes of meeting. It was slower than that, and quieter, and the slowness and the quietness were the mechanism. An was, genuinely, interesting to talk to. I want to say that plainly, not as a defense but as a fact. She had an intellectual engagement with property law and land registration that went beyond the clerical requirements of her job. She could explain the history of the Chanote system in Thailand, how it replaced older, less secure title formats, how the digital registration network had changed the speed of transfers, where the remaining vulnerabilities in the system were. This is not information you'd expect from a 24-year-old who processed forms for a living. She had read about it. She was curious about it. I found that genuinely engaging, the same way I found it engaging when people knew things about soil chemistry or cultivar selection that went beyond what their circumstances strictly required them to know. People who are interested in things are interesting. That was true of her. She was also, consistently and without exception, decent company. She was direct in the way of people who haven't been trained into the social performance of withholding what they actually think. She told me once, in March, that she found most of the foreign men who came into the land office condescending in a way they didn't notice themselves being, that they assumed confusion rather than asking clarifying questions, that they talked at rather than to. She said this without apparent concern about whether I'd find it uncomfortable. I didn't. I agreed with her, if I'm honest. I had probably been that man on my first visit. The observation cost her nothing socially to make and gained her nothing materially, and I filed it in the category of things that seemed authentic. I bought her a small jade pendant in a market stall near the night bazaar in early April. 1,800 baht, which was about 45 pounds, and she looked at it for a long moment before saying thank you, and then said, "You don't have to buy me things." I said I knew I didn't have to. She said, "Some men think gifts are a kind of payment." I said I was aware of that, and this wasn't. She put it on and wore it regularly after that, or at least she wore it when she was with me, and I never thought to notice whether it was around her neck on the evenings I arrived unannounced. We had coffee twice before Neil came to me with a look I recognized from people who are about to say something they know you don't want to hear. He'd seen me at the land office on one of my later visits and had put together what was happening. He told me, over a beer at his house near the Ping River, about a British man named Robert he'd known in Chiang Mai 3 years before, who had become involved with a woman who worked in a business adjacent to property development, and who had purchased land in her name and lost it within a year, to a sale she'd arranged independently while he was back in the UK for 6 weeks visiting his family. He told me the story without flourish, the way people in the expat community tell these stories, as documentation rather than drama. Here is what happened to this person. Here are the coordinates. Navigate accordingly. I thanked him for it. I told him that I understood the risks and that I was taking appropriate care. He looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then we talked about something else. Here is what I was thinking in that moment, as precisely as I can reconstruct it, that Robert had been a different kind of man, making a different kind of decision, that a man who purchased land in a woman's name after a short acquaintance was taking a gamble, and that what I was building with On was not a gamble but a relationship, something real and mutual and earned, and that the romantic dimension of eventually including her name on any property I purchased was of a different category entirely from the mercenary transaction Neil was cautioning me about. I was a man who believed in symbols. I had worked with growing things my whole life. I understood that the deed to a piece of land was not just a document, but an expression of belonging, of rootedness, of permanent commitment. Putting her name on it, I thought, was the kind of gesture that would mean something, that would last. Looking back, I can identify the exact shape of my reasoning and recognize it as the structure of a man who has decided what he wants to believe and is working backward from the conclusion. I'm not excusing it, I'm just naming it accurately. By April of 2020, I was visiting On regularly, evenings mostly, at the food market near the Doi Saket district office, or at a small restaurant run by her aunt along the main road east of town. I had extended my tourist visa through the process of border runs that was still functional at that period, crossing to Mae Sai in the north and returning the same day, which bought me another 30 days each time, and which I performed twice before applying for a non-immigrant visa that allowed a longer legal stay. By June I had met her mother, a sturdy woman named Mali who ran the family's remaining rice plot with the help of Aun's younger brother, a man in his mid-20s whose name was Ped. I met Ped twice in those early months. He was quiet and watchful in the way of certain young men who are doing their own calculations behind a neutral expression. I registered his watchfulness and filed it as shyness. The land purchase discussion became concrete in August. I had been looking at small plots in the Doi Saket area with some seriousness, having decided that a modest house on an acre or so of garden land was both affordable within my budget and consistent with what I actually wanted from this stage of life. Something I could plant, something I could tend, something with soil I could work. Neil's lawyer, a Thai man named Wichai who had been practicing property law in Chiang Mai for 15 years, reviewed the options with me and outlined the structures. A 30-year lease was the cleanest legal protection, he said, and the most defensible if contested. Purchasing in On's name was legal, but carried the risk that I had already been cautioned about, which I acknowledged, and which I intended to mitigate through a usufruct agreement and a registered leaseback, essentially layering two instruments on top of the title registration, both of which would, in theory, protect my right to occupy and use the property, regardless of who held the Chanote. I should tell you now something that I didn't know until much later, which is that On's brother Ped had identified the specific plot I eventually purchased before I did, not the week I signed the papers, before I began looking in earnest. He knew the plot because the family of the seller was known to him. It was the kind of knowledge that moves through rural Thai communities in ways that a foreigner living adjacent to those communities cannot track. And he had discussed with his sister the possibility of acquiring it for a price he could afford if he could obtain access to the capital. The capital was me. I don't know precisely when the plan crystallized, whether it was before On first spoke to me in the land office or during the months of our courtship. Wichai thinks it was early. The timing suggests early. The plot was 1.8 rai, approximately 0.7 acres, of mixed-use land, about 3 kilometers east of the Doi Saket market, with mature fruit trees, longan and mango, mostly, along the northern boundary, and good light on the south face where I intended to establish raised beds and eventually a small polytunnel. The existing structure on the land was a basic open-sided sala, pavilion, and a concrete water storage tank, neither of which I intended to keep. The price, negotiated through an agent, was 2,100,000 baht, at the August 2020 exchange rate of approximately 40 baht to the pound. That was 52,500 pounds. Modest, well within my means. I was pleased with the figure, and pleased with the land, and pleased, in a way I find difficult to describe without embarrassment, with the gesture I had decided to make. I told Anne I was putting the deed in her name. I made something of a ceremony of telling her. We were eating at the aunt's restaurant the evening before the scheduled signing date, and I said, I am not going to reproduce the exact words because they pain me, that I wanted her to know that I was not doing this reluctantly, that I was not putting her name on the document because Thai law left me no choice, but because I chose it, because I wanted her to have something permanent, because a man who had spent his life planting things understood that ownership of soil was the deepest kind of commitment he could offer. She cried. I remember that clearly. She put her hand over her eyes and her shoulders shook, and she reached across the table and gripped my wrist and said, No one has ever done anything like this for me. I believed her absolutely. The signing was on a Tuesday in September, which I attended. The usufruct agreement and the 30-year leaseback were registered on the same day, the instruments stacked on the title exactly as he'd recommended. I signed everything that required my signature. An signed everything that required hers. The Chanote was issued in her name. The whole process took about 2 hours at the land office, which was the same land office where she worked, with colleagues she saw every day, processing documents she handled routinely. I notice, now, the elegant economy of that arrangement. She knew every person in the room. She knew exactly what documents meant what, and which registration timestamps mattered, and which procedures could be expedited. She knew the system from the inside in a way I could not have known it from any angle. 6 days later, she sold the land to her brother for 1,800,000 baht. I didn't know this had happened. That's the thing that I return to most often when I think about those weeks. There was a period of roughly 5 weeks, from the signing in September to the discovery in late October, during which I was living in a rented house in Doi Saket, planning the garden, sketching layouts for the raised beds, walking the plot in the early mornings when the light was good, thinking about what to plant first. An and I were together in the normal rhythm of what our relationship had been. She was at work during the day. We ate together in the evenings. She was, if anything, more affectionate than she had been in the weeks leading up to the signing. Lighter, more at ease. The particular ease of someone who has resolved a tension they'd been carrying. I read it as her happiness at what I'd done. The release of knowing she had something that was hers. I was gratified by it. I was the landscape gardener who'd planted the thing and was now watching it take root. What I was actually observing, I now understand, was the relief of someone who has completed a job and no longer needs to sustain a particular performance. The work was done. The deed was in her name. The transfer to PED could proceed, or had already proceeded. 6 days was all it took, and she had the procedural knowledge to make 6 days enough. Whatever effort she had been expending to maintain the warmth and the attentiveness and the quality of presence that had made me trust her was no longer operationally necessary, and the easing of that effort read to me as contentment. I thought she was happy. She probably was, just not for the reason I imagined. She bought a new phone in late September, a mid-range Samsung, black, with a cover she'd ordered separately that she fitted herself at the dinner table one evening, while I watched some British gardening program I'd found on YouTube. I noticed the phone because her previous one had been old and cracked at one corner, the kind of phone that indicates a person who hasn't had the discretionary income to replace things when they wear out. I noticed the new one and thought, good, she has something decent now. I genuinely thought that. It didn't occur to me to ask where the money had come from, because I had recently, in my mind, established her on a firm financial footing by putting a piece of land in her name, and the logic of that she now had security, made other questions feel redundant. There was an afternoon, maybe 2 weeks after the signing, when I arrived at the land early and found that someone had been on the plot. Not doing anything I could specifically identify, just someone had been there. The ground near the sala had a fresh boot print in the soft earth from the previous night's rain, pointing inward from the boundary, the print of a boot larger than mine. I mentioned it to Ann that evening. She said it was probably someone from the neighboring plot crossing through to check on their irrigation ditch, which ran along the eastern boundary. I accepted this. It was plausible. It is still plausible. But I think about it now. There was also the evening. This would have been early October, perhaps 3 weeks before Sutita knocked on my gate, when I mentioned, idly, over dinner, that I was thinking of beginning the groundwork the following week, hiring a local contractor to clear the space for the first raised beds. Ann's reaction was small and controlled, but it was there. A slight flicker. The briefest possible pause before she said that sounded good, that she was sure I could find someone reliable. I noted the pause and then, almost immediately, let it go. The way you release a breath you didn't mean to hold. I'm the kind of person who notices things and then talks himself out of noticing them. I had been doing it, I realize now, since before the signing. Perhaps since before the purchase. Perhaps since the afternoon I went back to the land office with a question I could have asked by phone. There was one evening, this would have been late September, maybe 3 weeks after the signing, when I arrived at the restaurant to meet her, and she was already there with Ped. They were sitting close together over a phone, looking at something on the screen, and they adjusted when I arrived in a way that felt natural at the time, but which I've replayed since with a different understanding. Ped left shortly after I sat down. Ann put the phone in her bag. She told me Ped was sorting out some family paperwork and had needed her help understanding something. I accepted this without pursuing it. Ped was always sorting out family paperwork, in the vague and unspecific way that family members in the background of these stories are always doing things that have explanations but no details. I should tell you about the neighbor, because he's the reason I found out it all. His name was Prassert, and he farmed a plot immediately to the east of my land, and he was in his 60s and spoke no English, and had a habit of appearing along the boundary line in the early mornings when I was walking the plot, and we had developed a nodding acquaintance of the kind that exists between people who cannot speak to each other but share proximity to the same soil. His daughter, a woman in her 30s named Sutita, worked at a school near the main road and spoke good English, and occasionally served as an informal interpreter when her father wanted to communicate something beyond what pointing could accomplish. Sutita appeared at my rented house on a Saturday morning in late October. I remember it was a Saturday, because I'd been planning to drive to the Chiang Mai flower market that morning. There's a good wholesale market near Talat Warorat, where I'd been sourcing some planting material, and the knock at the gate came before I'd had breakfast. She was uncomfortable in the way of someone who has decided to do something difficult and is committed to it, but wishes circumstances were otherwise. She said she wasn't sure if she should be telling me this. She said her father had seen something and was concerned, and had asked her to come. What her father had seen was on, about 2 weeks after the signing, at the plot I'd purchased, with a man Prassert recognized as a regular presence in the area. Money had changed hands, a significant amount. Prassert described it to his daughter as a thick envelope, the kind of envelope that contains enough cash to require 2 hands to count. He hadn't understood what it meant at the time, but had remembered it, and when he saw me on the land some days later, alone, apparently unaware that anything had occurred, he'd eventually concluded that I ought to know. I thanked Sutita. I closed the gate after her and stood in the front garden of the rented house for what was probably 5 minutes, looking at the bougainvillea growing over the fence. I'd trimmed it a few weeks earlier because the stems were starting to block the light on that side. Funny thing to remember. I walked back inside and rang Wichai. What Wichai told me, after 2 days of checking, 2 days during which I went about the ordinary business of my life in a state of suspended comprehension, eating and sleeping and walking the plot as though nothing were different, confirmed and exceeded what Prassert had seen. The Chanote for the land, had been transferred to a new owner 6 days after my signing. The new owner was registered at an address in the Doi Saket area. The transfer had been processed at the Doi Saket land office. The consideration stated on the transfer document was 1,800,000 baht, 300,000 baht less than I'd paid. The usufruct agreement and the leaseback, the legal instruments which I had registered to protect me, were gone. Not contested, not challenged. Gone. The registration of the title transfer had been processed in a way that which I said he had never encountered before, with both protective instruments struck from the record simultaneously and without notification, at a speed that implied insider knowledge of the registration system and the specific timestamps involved. Someone who worked in the land office, he said carefully, would know how to do this. Someone who processed these documents every day would understand exactly which steps to take and in what order. She had sold it to her brother. The name on the new Chanote was the name of Ped. I drove to her house that evening. Not the aunt's restaurant. Her actual house, the family home near the rice plot where she lived with her mother. I had been there twice before, early in our relationship, and I knew the road. I knocked. Malie answered and looked at me with an expression I have turned over many times since, trying to read what was in it. Not surprise. Something more composed than surprise. She called into the house, and on came to the door. I asked her to come outside, and she did, and we stood at the edge of the road with the early dark coming in, and the sound of rice-field frogs starting up in the paddies behind the house, and I told her what which I had told me. I laid it out plainly. The transfer, the date, the price, the name on the Chanote. I watched her face while I said it. There was a moment, very brief, a fraction of a second, where she made a decision about how to respond. And then the decision was made, and she looked at me with an expression of concern and said, "There must be a mistake." I said, "There was no mistake," which I had the documentation. She said there must be an error at the office, that documents sometimes get processed incorrectly, that she would check on Monday when she was back at work. I said I would like her to explain to me how her brother's name came to be on the Chanote for land I purchased 6 days after I signed the transfer into her name. She said she didn't know anything about that. She said it quietly and steadily, and without any visible agitation, in the tone of a person who has prepared for this conversation and is delivering prepared remarks. I pushed further, which I want to say because I've heard the version of this story in my own head, where I simply crumbled and accepted whatever she said, and that's not quite what happened. I told her I wanted to see her phone. I said I wanted to see any messages between her and Ped from the week of the signing. She said she'd deleted them. I said, "Why would you delete messages from your brother?" She said she deleted everything regularly. She didn't like clutter. I said that the usufruct and the leaseback had both been removed from the title registration simultaneously with the transfer, and that this was not something that happened by accident, and that a person who worked in the office that processed these documents would know exactly how to arrange for it to happen. She looked at me for a long time without responding. Then she said, "You're accusing me of something." I said I was asking her to account for what the documents showed. She said, "I think you should go." And that was the end of the conversation. Malie was visible in the doorway behind her throughout. She didn't say anything either. Of course she had prepared for this. She had been preparing for it since before the first time I walked into the Doi Saket land office with a question about foreign property ownership, and she handed me an information sheet. I drove back to the rented house. I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook I'd been using for garden plans, sketches of bed layouts, lists of what to order, measurements I'd taken by pacing the plot, and I turned to a blank page and wrote out the numbers. The land, £52,500. The legal fees for the usufruct and leaseback, £1,800. The cash I'd given on over the months of our relationship, for various things I now assembled into a list for the first time. 45,000 baht to fix her mother's water pump, 80,000 baht for Ped's motorbike that he needed for work, 30,000 baht for school fees for a cousin's child, whose circumstances I never properly understood, 55,000 baht for a market stall her mother had apparently been discussing buying for years. That was 210,000 baht. approximately £5,250 at the average exchange rate of that period. Total financial exposure, approximately £59,550. I added to that list a column I hadn't originally intended to include, which was the cost of the months themselves. The rent, the flights, the visa extensions, the living expenses, the legal fees I was now accumulating with Wichai. That total came to approximately £14,200. Grand total lost in Thailand, £73,750. I stared at the number for a while. Then I poured a glass of scotch. I'd bought a bottle of Lafroig at the duty-free on the way out, months before, and had been rationing it with irrational care, the way you ration something you associate with home when you're far from it. And I drank it slowly, while I looked at the garden plan sketches, the raised bed layout, the position of the polytunnel, the note about bamboo sourcing I'd written in the margin in September, 3 days before the signing, when I'd been full of plans. I thought about the nursery in Shropshire, the way my father had built the first polytunnel with second-hand hoops and reclaimed polythene, the way the first winter had nearly finished the whole thing before it started, the way the perennial beds had taken 4 years to produce anything worth selling. Everything I'd ever built had required patience and time, and the willingness to tend something that wouldn't give anything back for years. I had tried to apply that to a relationship. I had tried to tend it. The problem is that a plant does not have its own intentions about what happens to the ground it grows in. That's what I told my son when he came down from Bristol 2 weeks later, drove down to Chiang Mai. No, that's wrong. I keep mixing up the geography in my memory. He couldn't come to Chiang Mai. I mean, when I called him, I set it down the phone to his patient silence. The problem isn't that I was trusting. The problem is that I trusted something that already knew what it was going to do with my trust. He said, "Come home, Dad." The second time he'd said it, I said, "I will, but not yet." I needed a few more weeks to do what I was doing, which was mostly just walking the plot in the mornings and understanding, one morning at a time, that it was not mine. Which I spent the following 3 weeks doing what lawyers do in these situations, which is establishing very clearly and professionally what cannot be done. The transfer had been executed correctly, or at least in a manner that would require extensive litigation to challenge, and the protective instruments had been removed through a process that was, as far as he could determine, technically within the authority of the Land Office to execute if certain conditions were met, conditions that someone with inside knowledge could arrange to meet. Challenging the transfer would require a civil case that could run for 2 or more years, cost a significant fraction of my remaining capital, and produce an outcome that Wichai was not in a position to predict with confidence. He said this honestly and without softening it, and I respected him for that. I rang my son in Bristol from the rented house one evening in November, sitting on the back step with a mug of tea that went cold while I was talking. My son is 38 and works in financial services, which means he understands contracts and asset transfers, and the specific horror of discovering that a legal instrument you believed protected you has been surgically removed. He listened to everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, you need to come home." I said I wasn't ready. He said, "What are you not ready for?" I didn't have an answer that made sense. I stayed until January. Not because I was fighting anything, Wichai's assessment had removed any practical reason to fight, but because leaving felt like agreeing with something I wasn't ready to agree with. I drove past the land a few times. No one was doing anything with it. The longan trees along the northern boundary were the same. The light on the south face was exactly as I'd assessed it when I'd decided to buy the plot. Long and clear in the mornings. Ideal for growing. Someone will eventually plant something there. It won't be me. I flew back to the UK on the 15th of January, and my son picked me up from Heathrow, and we drove to Bristol, and I slept for 11 hours in his spare room, and woke up to English grey and the sound of traffic, and felt, more than anything, a tiredness so thorough it seemed structural, as though the frame of me had been changed somehow. I'm in Bristol now, in a flat 2 streets from my son's house, which costs me £650 a month, and which I furnished from a charity shop over 3 days in February. I have £31,000 left of my £255,000. After the land purchase, the legal fees in Thailand, the gifts and loans to An and her family, the flights and accommodation and living costs of 15 months in Chiang Mai, and the costs of coming home. My pension, the personal one I'd fed through the nursery years, pays out £840 a month, which covers the rent and a small amount beyond. I am 69 years old. I grow things in pots on the balcony. I've got a dozen terracotta pots out there. Herbs, a small bay tree, a camellia that's not quite happy but is tolerating the container. It's not a lot, but I water them in the mornings and it helps. Here is what I know. Sitting here with the Bristol rooftops out the window and a pot of tea going cold beside the keyboard. I know that I was not tricked by love. I know that now, in a way I didn't know it at the time. What I was tricked by was the story I told myself about love, specifically about romantic gesture. I had a theory that putting her name on the deed was meaningful because it was voluntary, because I could have done the lease, the foreign company structure, the safer route, and I chose not to, because choosing the vulnerable option was, I thought, the proof of my sincerity. I had turned my own legal exposure into a declaration. That's what she understood about me that I didn't understand about myself. That I would interpret risk as romance, and that I would therefore make myself maximally vulnerable in the name of commitment. She was 24 years old and she worked in a land office, and she had watched farang buyers come in with their plans and their lawyers and their legal instruments. And she understood, from the inside, which instruments could be undone, and how long it would take, and what the process looked like. I was 68 years old, and I had spent my life in soil, and I understood how to read a plant, and how to read weather, and I had apparently never learned how to read the difference between a person who wants what you're offering and a person who wants what you're carrying. I want to say something else, which is this: the speed of it. 6 days. That number still stops me when it surfaces. In 35 years of running a nursery, I never saw anything establish itself in 6 days. A seedling in 6 days is barely a seedling. A cutting in 6 days hasn't decided yet whether it intends to root. The slowest things I worked with, the specimen yews, the mature hollies, the things that take a decade to reach any size worth selling, those were the things I trusted most, because time had tested them. The transaction that took the land from my name to Ped's name in 6 days, arranged by a woman who had known the outcome before the relationship had any real history at all, was as fast as anything I have ever encountered, and as total. There was nothing slow about it. There was nothing that could be called organic. It was a mechanism, efficiently executed, and I was the material it processed. I want to say this to anyone thinking about buying property in Thailand with a Thai partner, and I want to say it without bitterness, which is hard, but I'll try. The legal structures that exist to protect foreign buyers are real. They are not useless, but they operate within a system, and if the person you are dealing with understands that system better than you do, works inside it, knows the procedures and the timelines, and which clerk processes which document, then the structures are only as strong as the integrity of the person whose name is on the title. If that integrity is absent, no instrument is foolproof. Know who you are dealing with. Not as a romantic assessment, but as a factual one. Verify what can be verified. Watch what can be watched. Do not confuse the willingness to be vulnerable with the wisdom of being vulnerable. They are very different things, and the difference costs money you cannot get back. Take time. More time than feels comfortable. More time than your feelings say is necessary. In horticulture, there is a principle called hardening off. The process of gradually exposing a plant raised under protection to the real conditions of the outdoor world, slowly, over days and weeks, before committing it to the ground permanently. You do this because a plant that goes straight from the polytunnel into open soil in March is at serious risk from conditions it hasn't had time to adjust to. The principle transfers. Whatever you are considering doing with your money in Thailand, harden it off first. Give it time. Give it conditions. Let the thing that seems true in the warmth of early feelings survive a spell of colder weather before you trust it with everything you have. The longan trees will be coming into fruit about now, in the hills east of Doi Saket. I know the season. I know because I stood under those trees in September and thought, next year I'll harvest these myself. I had plans. I had graph paper with bed layouts and a list of what to order from a seed supplier in Chiang Mai, and a note about where to source bamboo for the first polytunnel frame. I was going to plant things that would last 20 years. I was going to tend something again. Somebody else is tending it. Good luck to them, I suppose. Good luck to all of us.